So since we're on the topic of really trying to get guys from, the beginning of their career through mid-career and getting them through the end of their career, hopefully not in poor shape when they come out so they can kind of live the second half of their life. What are some common mistakes that you see these guys making at different stages of the career that leads to some of those situations where they're in rough shape by the time that they're ready to retire or get out?
The number one thing that we see, two things. First one is putting way too much of an emphasis on lifting. Obviously, lifting is a big component. It's a big component of our training, but guys get fixated on hitting these max, like one rep max numbers, and trying to hit this 500-pound deadlift or 500-pound squat. And the biggest thing that I preach to our community, the people that follow us on social media, is the gym is a tool that enhances our ability to perform outside of it. So lifting, we want to, obviously impose, like, lift heavier weights, impose the rule of progressive overload, but we don't want to get so fixated on trying to hit a specific number that we have a breakdown in form, and then end up developing injuries outside of it. So that's the number one thing that I've seen, both going up through the preparation, going through selection, going through those environments that I see, is guys trying to just do way too much, instead of just prioritizing consistency, prioritizing obviously like full range of motion, even with the running and rucking, like an actual progression, and then having a little bit of patience with their performance, instead of trying to just jump up and weight very quickly. That leads to a lot of breakdown, that leads to a lot of injuries. And even in the SF environment, I'm sure you see it, down in Ranger Regiment, guys. There's a lot of egos and there's a lot of ego lifting. It's cool that guys push each other and things like that. But when you're in an environment that requires you to perform at a high level physically, even a small injury that, something, you strain something, something pops, whatever, from putting way too much of an emphasis on hitting this one rep max, causes a lot of lasting injuries. And in these types of places where it's always go go go, you don't get a whole lot of downtime, or sometimes it can be hard to kind of take a knee and let that heal up. So then the injury just gets worse over time, and then obviously ends up developing further issues down the road. So that is one of the biggest things I see. The other is with the running side of it, is just not having a progression, or guys train like they're in selection, just doing way too many miles, just putting up way too much weight on their back. Or just like foregoing the progression as a whole, and then developing those nagging injuries associated with it. Shin splints, Achilles tendonitis, all that good stuff. We could get into the whole realm of lack of recovery and poor nutrition, things like that. But typically, the one that is the most simple fix for those guys is changing the way that they view preparing or training, and instead of getting fixated on those numbers, like understanding the purpose behind a specific session, and building off of that. So that's probably the biggest one that we see, which is a mistake that I made when I was going through too. When I was, the 18-year-old, I went to selection at 22. So when I first started preparing for selection, I did the same stuff, right? I increased my mileage too quickly, got Achilles tendonitis. I tried to lift too heavy, hurt my back. Like, I made all of the mistakes. So one of our biggest goals is to just share the lessons learned and those insights from the mistakes that we made. So, the next generation going through doesn't make them, and they can obviously perform much better than we did.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's, every unit is different, but there's definitely going to be those individuals who, they're going to be really talented in one area, or maybe focusing a lot of their time in one area. So like those one rep max deadlifts, but then maybe they're not really focusing on work capacity. And so there can be kind of sometimes an imbalance, or I'll see it the opposite, where you have these individuals who have like just great VO2, just running all the time, but then they don't have a lot of strength, and so as soon as you put them under load, they just fall apart.
Yeah.
Um, So I think mentioning that you really need that balance in your training is important. And I think for individuals who don't have a background in strength and conditioning, if you're not working with someone who can smartly program that for you, it can be very easy to get into a state of overtraining,
Yeah.
especially because when we look like at athletes at that level, your soft guys, your rangers, your green berets, right, and even beyond that, it can be very easy to get into a state of overreaching or overtraining because unlike the gen pop, it's very easy to outwork your calories um, in a lot of different training scenarios. Even just on a day-to-day basis, most of these guys who take their physical performance seriously are going to be training probably twice a day.
Yeah. Yeah. And you brought up a good point. Outpacing your calories is another issue that we typically see is once we get guys in and start looking at what they're eating, we often find that they're simply not eating enough, right? That is a huge um, issue, a very common issue, I would say. But yeah, in regards to the training aspect, I think it breeds an environment where individuals think they need to be doing way more or way more complicated training than what it actually takes. Whereas, prioritizing consistency, training with intensity is the way to get there. So a lot of it is simplifying and then kind of just removing that guesswork from the noise of social media and obviously the internet today saying like how much you need to be doing, and in reality it's much more simple than most people really think.
Yeah, and the patience that you mentioned, that's really important. And then also just like the mental aspect of, maybe you have gotten to a place where you're injured or you're dealing with some nagging injuries, or worst case scenario, you have, kind of a catastrophic injury, or now maybe you're in a boot, maybe you have a rod shoved up your leg. Maybe you're having to have like multiple surgeries. And that can be really difficult for someone who has a high performance mindset, has never really had to pump the brakes before. And I think it's really common also just to see people they either seem to do really well and buy into their rehab process, or they just kind of fall apart, right? And for those individuals who experience that, what are some ways, I don't know if you've experienced any injuries yourself, but what are some ways that somebody who's injured, maybe going through the rehab process, can can mentally kind of get themselves through that?